So why do Orthodox Christians kiss icons, bow before them, or light candles in front of them? To many people, it looks like idolatry. The Bible does say you shall not make for yourself a carved image, as well as God forbidding graven images in the Ten Commandments. In this video, we're going to cover all these topics. Starting off, the Bible doesn't condemn religious images. What it condemns is the worship of images as gods. Scripture repeatedly shows that God himself commanded sacred images to be made and honored in worship. When we understand this distinction, icon veneration makes perfect sense. The most common objection, Exodus 20, verses 4 through 5, says, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them." Many people stop reading here and conclude that all religious images are forbidden, but if that's true, then God immediately contradicts himself. Just 5 chapters later, in Exodus 25, 18 through 20, God commands Moses, "And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold at the 2 ends of the mercy seat." These weren't simply decorations. They were placed inside the Holy of Holies, the holiest place on earth where God manifested his presence. If all religious images were sinful, God wouldn't have commanded them to be made. This means the commandment isn't against making images themselves, it's against making idols and worshiping them as gods. The Bible consistently makes this distinction. In Exodus 20, God condemns idols. In Exodus 25, he commands sacred images. We can see this again in 1 Kings 6, when Solomon builds the temple. The walls were covered with carved cherubim, palm trees, and flowers. There were giant cherubim in the Holy of Holies, with wings stretching across the room. Sacred images filled God's temple because God has never been opposed to holy images themselves. Some may object by saying that people bow before icons. The problem with that objection is that Scripture never teaches that bowing itself is worship. In Genesis 33:3, Jacob bows 7 times before his brother Esau. Was Jacob worshiping Esau? Of course not. In 1 Kings 1:23, Nathan bows before King David. Throughout Scripture, bowing is often used as a sign of honor and respect, not worship. The Bible actually uses different actions and determines whether they're worship based upon their purpose. Kneeling isn't always worship, as well as singing isn't always worship, and even bowing isn't always worship. What makes something worship is offering it what belongs to God alone. When Orthodox Christians bow before icons, they aren't saying that wood and paint are God. They're honoring the person depicted on the icon. The Bible itself teaches this principle. In Exodus 25:22, God tells Moses, "And there I will meet with you, and I will speak with you from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim." Notice that God chose to make his presence known in connection with sacred images. No Israelite thought that they were worshiping gold cherubim. The honor shown there ultimately belonged to God. Another important example is found in Numbers 21. The Israelites were dying from poisonous serpent bites, so God commanded Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, shall live." Moses obeyed and made the bronze serpent. God used a sacred image as a means of grace and healing. Some people might object and say that the bronze serpent was later destroyed. That is true, but why was it destroyed? 2 Kings 18 tells us that King Hezekiah destroyed it because the people had begun burning incense to it. The problem wasn't the image itself, the problem was idolatry. Notice the pattern throughout Scripture. God commands images. The people misuse images. God condemns the misuse, not the images themselves. The same principle applies to icons. If someone worshipped an icon as God, that would be idolatry. Orthodox Christianity condemns just as strongly as Scripture does, but honoring an image because of the person it represents is entirely different. There's one final biblical point that is probably the most important of all: the incarnation. John 1:14 says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." God became visible. In Colossians 1:15, Paul calls Jesus the image of the invisible God. And Jesus himself in John 14:9 says, "He who has seen me has seen the Father." Before Christ, God has not taken on human nature. But through the incarnation, God became visible in the person of Jesus Christ. This is why Christians from the very beginning depicted Christ visually. We aren't attempting to paint the divine essence of God, we are depicting Jesus Christ, the God who became man and was seen, touched, and even heard. 1 John 1 begins by saying, "That which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled." The early church understood this, and St. John of Damascus wrote, "I do not worship matter. I worship the creator of matter, who became matter for my sake, and deigned to inhabit matter, who worked out my salvation through matter." St. John goes on to explain that because Christ truly became man, Christians may depict him visually without falling into idolatry. The honor shown to the image passes to the person depicted, not to the material itself. This teaching was formally affirmed by the Seventh Ecumenical Council in 787. The bishops gathered at the council defended the ancient Christian practice of venerating icons and declared, "The honor paid to the image passes to the prototype. and whoever venerates the image venerates it in the reality of what is there represented. The council made an important distinction between worship and veneration. Worship, which is what the Greek fathers called iatria, belongs to God alone. Veneration, called proskinesis, may rarely be offered as an expression of honor. When Orthodox Christians kiss an icon or bow before it, they are not worshiping wood and paint. They are honoring Christ, his mother, or his saints. Finally, we should remember that Scripture constantly treats material things as vehicles through which God works. The Ark of the Covenant was holy. Elijah's mantle performed miracles. Elijah's bones raised the dead. And we also can't forget about any of the miracles that Jesus did, including touching people to heal their sicknesses. Matter doesn't go against or contradict God. God uses matter to communicate with his grace. Icons fit perfectly with this biblical worldview. The Bible condemns idolatry. It does not condemn sacred images of Christ, his mother, or the saints. God commanded cherubim to be made. God's temple was filled with holy images. The bronze serpent was used by God for healing. Bowing is often an act of honor rather than worship, and most importantly, God himself became visible in Jesus Christ. The Church Fathers defended icons because they defended the reality of the Incarnation, and the Seventh Ecumenical Council preserved this apostolic teaching by distinguishing worship from veneration. Icon veneration isn't worshiping wood and paint, but it's showing honor to Christ and his saints through their images. Just as Scripture distinguishes between worship, which belongs to God alone, and honor, which can rightly be given to God's servants. The biblical question isn't whether sacred images may exist. God himself answered that question 1,000 years ago. They can. The real question is whether we worship them as gods or honor what they represent. Scripture condemns the first and permits the second.